Let's have a little bit of a debate and ask a question in this video. Inevitably, it's going to have to come up, but let's talk about General Manager Brad Treliving. Is it time the Calgary Flames should possibly consider moving on from Brad Treliving? Hi there, it's Brett Hornby here, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. And as this recording, unfortunately, the Calgary Flames did not make the playoffs for the 2021 season. Definitely, given where the team is at. It was just a couple years ago, the Calgary Flames were first in the Western Conference, and I always said then, had the best regular season in a generation. But during the time that the Calgary Flames have had General Manager Brad Treliving, it seems like this team hasn't really taken that next step in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I mean, he has been the general manager for the Calgary Flames for 7 years. He was hired at the end of the 2013-14 season, after when the Calgary Flames decided to move on from Jay Feaster, and in retrospect, I think that was definitely the right call when we brought Brian Burke in as president of hockey operations. I think the two moves that definitely sunk Jay Feaster as general manager is the return that we got for Jerome McGinley and Jay Bouwmeester. There was also that debacle with Ryan O'Reilly, where we offer sheeted him, and then he forgot that he had to get put on waivers first, and if Colorado didn't match at that time, we would have lost the first round pick. But the Calgary Flames were coming out of that, nuclear rebuild after when we moved on Jay Feaster and Brian Burke hired Brad Treliving. I mean, since then, the Calgary Flames have made the playoffs 4 times, because we made it in 2015, the first year under Brad Treliving as general manager, when he still inherited Bob Hartley as head coach, and that would be one of the points that I'll bring up that I think maybe we should possibly consider moving on from Brad Treliving. But then that was the year that we got to the second round. First time the Calgary Flames got out of the first round since 2004. And here's a heavy thought. The Calgary Flames have only gotten out of the first round twice since we won the Cup in 1989. So that's why it's a huge deal when we get out of the first round, and I enjoy it because it's been too long. But then the next season, Calgary regressed and missed the playoffs and decided to move on from Bob Hartley and decided to go with Glenn Gultson as head coach. And that was Brad Treliving's hire. I remember at that time, Calgary was considering either, it was Glenn Gultson that he went with. Actually, Jeff Ward was considered, that same Jeff Ward that eventually was coach. But then they also looked at Randy Carlyle, which would have been an okay pick in my mind at that time, but it would have not really been too much of a change from Bob Hartley. But the other coach that I liked that I think we should have hired in retrospect at that time was Kevin Dineen. Apparently those were considered. But then the next season, in 2017, we made the playoffs, I'm going to say on the strength of the fact that the Calgary had a great December after a very slow start in the 2016-17 season, and then won 10 in a row in March, just to get into the playoff hunt. And I mean, back in looking at the 2015 season, the Calgary Flames definitely had a lot of, come back from behind wins that was extra spectacular, that might have not been sustainable, and that might have been the case of what happened in 2017 when we got swept by the Anaheim Ducks. And then in 2018, things were looking all right to start, and then really fell off and had some injuries and missed the playoffs in 2018. And then once again, Brad Treliving decided it was time to change the coach. And we brought in Bill Peters from the Carolina Hurricanes, where he resigned from Carolina at the time with the new ownership with Ted Dundon coming over. So Bill Peters was in, and then let's say in 2019, it was very, very successful in the regular season, where we had the best regular season in a generation, finished first in the Western Conference. But then we had that brief cameo with the Colorado Avalanche, where we lost in 5 in an upset. And I think since then, this team hasn't been the same. And then the following season, well, it was definitely very, very eventful, because Calgary had a slow start, didn't have that same success, but then I can give Brad Schulivan a pass on the Bill Peters hiring because of what happened. There was definitely very extenuating circumstances that he wasn't going to come back, given what happened. You can read into what happened. I just don't want to touch upon it in this video. That we brought in Jeff Ward, who was on the coaching staff of Bill Peters, and Jeff Ward saved the season in 2019-20 and then the global pandemic, but I think this team was playoff bound. So if you keep track, that's the fourth time the Calgary Flames made the playoffs in 2015, 2017, and then 2019 and 2020, where we at least won the play-in series against the Winnipeg Jets, and then I say we progressed a little compared to the Colorado cameo against the Dallas Stars, and definitely lost in 6 games when we had a chance to go up 3-1 in a game we almost stole. But then this season, I mean, it was all extraordinary. Different circumstances being in the North All-Canadian Division, but once again, Brad Treliving decided to move on and let Jeff Ward go. He did. I think at the time he still deserved being hired or take the intern take off of him from last season. But it's still stunning that we brought in Darryl Sutter back as head coach to hopefully to save the season, but it felt like it was almost too late at that time. But the whole time that Brad Treliving's been general manager, coaching carousel definitely has spun. He inherited Bob Hartley from the previous era with Jay Feaster and Brian Burke as the acting general manager. And Brian Burke was the person that brought in Brad Treliving, and he's lasted 7 years. But we had a coaching carousel. Another way you could say it says volumes about the coaching choices is how many of those coaches that I read it off are still in the NHL as a head coach. The answer is 0 right now, because Bob Hartley, I understand he actually went over to coach in the KHL and actually recently won the Gregorian Cup. So he's had some success overseas. Glenn Galdson, well, I mean, he was a head coach before with the Dallas Stars, before being an assistant with the Vancouver Canucks, and then he came to Calgary. Well, he is coaching NHL, as I know, still as an assistant under Dave Tippett in Edmonton. So he is coaching the NHL, but not as a head coach. And not too sure if Glenn Galdson will ever be a head coach again. Bill Peters, well, I think it's extremely unlikely he is going to be a head coach again in the NHL. Not because of his coaching ability, but given what has happened and what we know now. He is over in the KHL right now. Someone might, take a chance and have Bill Peters as an associate or an assistant, but I don't think he's going to be back as an NHL head coach. And Jeff Ward, I think the jury's still out that Jeff Ward, I think, will be back as a coach on someone's staff, and I would dare say I think Jeff Ward will be a head coach again in the NHL. So that's just the coaching part. And then surprisingly, we brought Darryl Sutter back, and we promised him a couple more years after this season. I think we need a full season under Darryl Sutter next season, under more normal circumstances, to really judge Darryl Sutter. So there has to be assurance that if Calgary may consider moving on from Brad Treliving, which I'm kind of in the middle if we should. I mean, he has definitely, the coaching carousel definitely has continued, but you almost have to say we haven't had that high-priced coach in Calgary under his tenure, other than bringing Darryl Sutter back, which that was still a surprise, considering that Darryl Sutter said that he was retired from coaching and he was an advisor to the coaching staff with the Anaheim Ducks after his time with the Los Angeles Kings. And it's just, the past nostalgia with Darryl Sutter. But the jury's still on that, but I think for sure Darryl Sutter has to be considered to be coach at least next season to fulfill his contract. And then speaking of contracts, well, I know Brad Treliving, he is signed for, I believe, another couple more years. So the ownership definitely has spent more money on coaches not to coach and the general manager, but we're still in that mediocrity. Because while the coaches have been changed, the one thing definitely has stayed constant, which I think this off-season for sure, and I guess the other question to ask is Brad Treliving the person that you want to have faith in? But I think the Calgary Flames maybe not necessarily tear it down, do a nuclear winter like we did in 2013 when we finally decided it was time to move on from Jerome McGinley, Jay Bouwmeester, and Mika Kiprasov retiring. But I think some core players are definitely going to have to make some decision on them, looking at Sean Monahan and Johnny Gaudreau. they've always been here under Brad Treliving as general manager. And those players were brought in from the previous regime under Jay Feaster when Johnny Goodrow was drafted in 2011 and Sean Monahan was drafted in 2013. And then Mark Giordano has been the longtime captain. He was signed by Darryl Sutter when he was general manager after that run. And then Michael Backlund, which Darryl Sutter drafted in 2007. I mean, there's still pieces on this team from previous regimes, but it has been here for a long time that you might have to consider maybe it's time to cut bait. I mean, Mark Giordano, I think, might be... I'm actually willing to give a 50% chance that he is going to be a Flame next year because of the Seattle Kraken expansion draft, and he has one more year left of his contract, because I think he is going to be exposed to the expansion draft, considering who the defenseman that we have, and there's no way we're going to let Chris Tanev, Noah Hannafin, and Rasmus Anderson be exposed. Those players are definitely going to be protected, and then I made that video talking about Milan Lucic agreeing to waive his no movement clause so he could be exposed to protect the forwards, but I'm going to have to say you have to consider possibly a change, because that's the one thing that stayed constant, is the coaches have changed but the players have remained the same. And now that we brought in a more established coach in Darryl Sutter, that I said at that time when we hired him, other than holy shit a few times, because that was my initial reaction, that I said either the core is going to get changed or be changed, and it might be time to consider changing the core. But the other piece of that's where I think, this is where Brad Treliving really is going to have to really make a tough decision on the team. And then free agency, that's where he's been iffy in. I'm going to say this past season, when it comes to Jacob Markstrom and Chris Tanev, those are great signings. We definitely finally have found a stud goalie that Calgary hasn't had since Mika Kiprusoff when he retired, when we brought in Brad Treliving. I mean, went through Colorado, Jonas Hiller, that was his signing. And then we decided to go with Brian Elliott, Chad Johnson, and then we acquired Mike Smith. I mean, we went through all these goalies and then brought in Cam Talbot. Those were all stopgap goalies at the time until eventually we brought Jacob Markstrom. And then Chris Tanev, I mean, he has fit in very well with the Calgary Flames, but then the other free agent signings that hasn't worked out. I mean, Mason Raymond, Troy Brouwer in that 2016 free agency class, which then led to the James Neal signing where we had bought out Mason Raymond, Troy Brouwer, and then we bought out Michael Stone, the only sign him back, and I wouldn't be surprised if Michael Stone's back next season just as that seventh defenseman for depth. But then that James Neal was probably the worst deal that the Calgary Flames signed under free agent frenzy, where we had to agree to take on Milan Lucic's contract, and he has been a great fit for the Calgary Flames contract aside, but free agent frenzy definitely is where it's been iffy with Brad Treliving. I'm going to say this past year with the big signings has worked out, but some of these big name signings that looked big at the time hasn't worked out. So that's where you can also throw that in, but I'm going to still say we need to possibly look at making changes to the core, and is he the guy? But the last piece that we'll look at is his drafting record, and I'm going to say we've been better off drafting since he has taken over, because we have more players that are still in the system and has worked out. But I know the 2014 class was his first class that he was in charge of general manager. You can almost say that class is a write-off now, because the first pick that Brad Treliving ever made, which ultimately traded away in Sam Bennett. However, some will say that that trade that we made when we got that Hinman kid and a second-round pick in 2022, some would say that the fact that we weren't handcuffed like the Buffalo Sabres were with Taylor Hall, some say that we did better in that trade right now, that we got more for Sam Bennett to the Florida Panthers than we did that Taylor Hall got to the Buffalo Sabres and he sent him to Boston. And now Sam Bennett is looking awesome in the Florida Panthers, which you can also debate about the coaches again and the scouting system. But the other players definitely have not panned out. Well, Mason Mcdonald was the next player that Calgary Flames drafted, 34th overall, in 2014. The first goalie that was drafted. A couple picks later, this guy named Thatcher Demko was available. Whoops. And then we drafted Hunter Smith, which, remember, that's a pick that we got in that Reto Berra trade. He definitely hasn't panned out. And then Brandon Hickey, I know, is another player that we drafted that eventually was thrown in with the Arizona Coyotes when we got Mike Smith, because Arizona was looking for a goalie that they wanted to protect in the Vegas Golden Knights expansion draft. And then Adam Elias Matheson was the last pick that we made, or the second last pick. And then Austin Carroll, the 7th overall pick, or 7th round pick. So none of the players in the 2014 class are now with the Calgary Flames. And none of those other players, other than Sam Bennett, actually played in the NHL or made a big impact in the NHL. So the 2014 class definitely was his first class. Definitely hasn't worked out exactly. I mean, we got something for Sam Bennett. But the 2014 class is now a wash. But the 2015 class, I'm going to say, is the best class that the Calgary Flames had with Brad Treliving as general manager, considering we didn't have a first-round pick because the Calgary Flames traded a first-round pick and a second in the package to the Boston Bruins when we got Dougie Hamilton. And I'm going to say the best trades that Brad Treliving made was the Dougie Hamilton trade twice, when we got him and traded him away. But what makes that trade even better now for the Calgary Flames at that time is the Boston Bruins had 3 straight picks in the first round, 13th, 14th, and 15th overall, where they drafted Jacob Zerberol, defenseman, and then they drafted Jake DeBrust, who's been an okay player, and then Zachary Zenzen, who that was one of the picks, because Boston had a pick from Los Angeles and Calgary. The next 3 picks who they could have drafted, Boston Bruins definitely stings. 16th overall is Matthew Barzal, 17th overall is Kyle Connor, and the 18th overall is Thomas Chabot. Whoopsies. That's the thing with drafts. You just never know. But if the Boston Bruins would have picked those 3 players instead, that would have been a much better trade for the Boston Bruins for Dougie Hamilton. But considering that, we got Dougie Hamilton. The picks that the Calgary Flames drafted in 2015, well, we drafted Rasmus Andersson, and that was that first pick at 53rd overall. And that was the pick that we got from Vancouver for turning away Sven Berchi. And then we made a few trades with Tampa Bay to get Oliver Shillington. I'm going to say, considering they're still in the system, Rasmus Andersson definitely is looking like a top, even 2 defenseman for the Flames. However, Shillington is still on the line, but he's still in the system. That's pretty good picks for late in the second round. And then we drafted Pavel Karanov, who hasn't panned out because he hasn't played in NHL. I mean, he briefly played with the Calgary Hitmen. But the best pick that the Calgary Flames, I'm going to say, made, also in the 6th round, 160th overall, Andrew Mangiapane. So, not necessarily the best players you pick come in the first round. Then the last pick was Riley Bruce, who never panned out. But the 2015 class, we still got Rasmus Andersson, who's looking like to be a top 2 defenseman, especially, I think, going forward. And Andrew Mangiapane, who's starting to be a top 6 forward. So those 2 players, and then we still have Oliver Shillington. And then in 2016, well, I'm going to say the best pick that we made is Matthew Tkachuk. 6th overall, he fell down to 6, and when I saw him going down to 6, I was like, you got to run up to the podium and draft him. Especially when Edmonton and Vancouver passed on him. Makes it even more satisfying. And then another player that we drafted, which is jury's still out, is he's in the system but hasn't played with the Flames yet, is goalie Tyler Parsons. 54th overall, 56th overall was Dylan Dubé. That's definitely proven to be a solid pick. Well, 66th overall, it stings, but he pulled a Tim Erickson and Adam Fox. And that was why he was packaged in that trade when we traded Dougie Hamilton away. And then the Carolina Hurricanes traded him to the Rangers. Adam Fox is now looking like that's a steal in the 2016 draft, but Adam Fox didn't want to play, or he pulled a Tim Erickson, or even more famously a Eric Lindros. And then the other players we still have in the system are still looking intriguing. Well, Linus Lidstrom, I think, is not going to make it. I think he's not in the system anymore. Same with Mitchell Matson. But we still got Eetu Taloa, who's playing in the Stockton Heat, and Matthew Phillips. And also a Stefan Feltnowski, but Eetu Taloa and Matthew Phillips are still in the Stockton Heat system that looking to be very intriguing. Prospects that, especially Matthew Phillips, I think he could potentially look at bringing him in here for the next season. So that's the 2016 class. Then 2017, there's still a few players that Zuri's still on, including Yusuf Valimaki. I think he's still going through growing pains. That injury last year definitely set him back. But Yusuf Valimaki, I still say, is for sure an everyday defenseman for the Calgary Flames. Still figuring things out with Darryl Sutter. But in the fourth round, I like this prospect that I saw with the Stockton Heat and Adam Ruzicka. So this is what I'm saying. We're drafting better under Brad Treliving. This is where it's still a loaded question what we should do with him. Then the other players that we drafted in the 2017 class, I think they're no longer in the organization. That they're nowhere in the NHL. Knocking the door is Zach Fisher. Then there's Detarchin Jolie, which he didn't sign him. And then Felix Edison. I know that he's also, I think he's not with the organization anymore. But I'm going to still say Yusuf Valimaki and Adam Ruzicka. They're definitely still great that are still in the system. 2018, if we get any success, that's going to be a bonus, because that was also the year that you can maybe criticize Brad Treliving on the trade that we made when we acquired Travis Hamonic and traded away some draft picks that the New York Islanders use those picks on. They're looking like good prospects in their system, but a lot of these players are in the organization for the Calgary Flames of the Stockton Heat. Martin Pospisil, he is in the Stockton Heat. That was the first pick that we didn't have till 106th overall. Then I still can't pronounce this person's name, Dimitrios Kazumaitis. I think he is still in the system. And then Milos Roman, I think we moved on from him. But then we got Matthias Emil Pedersen, who was a big part of the Stockton Heat this year. And then I still can't pronounce this person's name, Dimitri Zagadordini. He's also in the Stockton Heat. So if we get anybody that pans out in the 2018 class, considering how late we drafted, that's a bonus. And then 2019 and 20, it's still, Jury's still out on it. Jacob Pelche was the player we drafted 26th overall in 2019. He's still looking good. He's still in the Major Junior Hockey League, but he hasn't moved up the system yet. And then you got Ilya Negioyev, and then you got Lucas Fuchs, Josh Nother, and then Dustin Wolf. That pick is definitely looking like to be a steal, given how Dustin Wolf looked with the Ever Silvertip. So the 2019 class, with the first and last picks, are definitely looking like top prospects for the Flames. Then in 2020, it's still really, really early. You got Conor Zari in the first round. He was the captain of the Kamloops Blazers. And then Jan Knetsov, who also we did recently sign in the organization. Then you got Jeremy Poirier, Jake Bolton, and then Daniel Cheliev. I heard after we drafted him, he was actually doing well as a goaltender in the Czech Republic. And then you got Ryan Francis, Rory Cairns, and Eli Solinov. But it's still too early to really judge how the Flames are going to do in those draft picks. But I'm going to say drafting, I'm going to still say we're definitely doing a lot better with Brad Treliving than compared to Jay Feaster or even Darryl Sutter during the time of their general manager. So let's kind of get back to where I said to start. Given that the Calgary Flames have been under Brad Treliving for 7 years, we made the playoffs 4 times in those 7 years, but it's kind of been that in-out pattern. We've kind of still maintained the same core, especially with Sean Monahan and Johnny Gaudreau, that we might have to really look at potentially making changes there, because it seems like we just haven't taken that next step. And you're not too sure if Brad Treliving is that person to do it as general manager. Especially, I'm going to say, if we were to move on from him, the only practical person that you can come in to replace Brad Treliving, if we decide to go down that route, is John Davidson, who is now available from the New York Rangers. And I think ultimately it's how the New York Rangers behaved with the Tom Wilson incident. I think none of those changes would have happened with the general manager, with John Davidson, Jeff Gordon, I meant to say, and David Quinn, the coach, who now the New York Rangers are apparently looking at bringing in Gerard Gallant. And that's been the rumor right now. But, what do you think about what I'm thinking? That it definitely has to be considered that I'm going to say, in terms of sustained success, we still seem to have kind of flatlined and plateaued, where we came out from the rebuild. I'm going to say all right, but we're not constantly rebuilding. But I think this team definitely seems to be stuck in neutral under Brad Treliving, because the ultimate success is going to be how we do in the playoffs. And I mean, what we did in 2015 was amazing, but I think part of it was a combination of those comeback from behind wins. We were doing winning games that weren't necessarily sustainable, and we had an extremely favorable matchup with the Vancouver Canucks in the first round at that time, where we definitely got schooled by the Anaheim Ducks. In the next round, even though Calgary was the lower seed, I think Calgary was the favorite to beat the Vancouver Canucks in the first round in 2015. And then we were a terrible matchup with the Anaheim Ducks, and even though we got swept, there were times where Calgary was close, but we always kept getting behind 1-0 early. And then in 2019, we had a lot of players that had career years, including Johnny Gaudreau, who was 1 point short of getting 100 points. And then Mark Giordano winning the Norris Trophy. That was definitely the big reasons why the Calgary Flames were able to have the best regular season in a generation. But it seemed like, although we didn't sustain that success the whole season, we definitely tailed off a little and definitely got schooled by Colorado. And I think that was the coming out for the Colorado Avalanche, that I think they are bound to make a run to the Stanley Cup. But Colorado was a team that really hit rock bottom a few years ago, that has really rebuilt and looks like they're a contender. That's been the kind of dilemma with the Calgary Flames, basically, since the late 1990s till now, is that when we've been bad, we haven't been bad enough to get that top, 3 pick. And then the worst part, you could be in the salary cap era, which is also going to be interesting. There's another video I'm going to make that might touch upon the core and should the Flames consider this. But it just seems like we spend the cap, but still either just miss the playoffs or we get in and get out in the first round. But the two things that definitely have remained constant since 2014 has been the core, especially Johnny Gaudreau and Sean Monahan. And I'm going to say they're great players, but they're great role players. What I mean is that they're not necessarily a player that you plaster on the marquee and say, he's the face of the franchise. Jarome Iginla was that player. Connor McDavid is that player, and same with Austin Matthews. For example, right now, those are players, and then still with Sidney Crosby and Alexander Ovechkin. Those are players that they can carry a team to the promised land, and a couple of them have, and I think Connor McDavid and Austin Matthews, I think they have what it takes that eventually in their careers they're going to be leading their team to the Stanley Cup. But a player that I could think of like a Sean Monahan and Johnny Gaudreau is almost like an Evgeny Malkin or a Phil Kessel, where they're good players, they're top six forward, but they're not necessarily that player that you would put on the marquee and say, this is the face of the franchise. And that's the other thing too, is I think it might be time to consider making those changes, because I mean, what they always say, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing but expect a different result. And it seems like we keep changing the coaches but kept the players and the general manager. But it's a loaded question, because there's not too many flops, but it's just we've been stuck in neutral. And that's how I feel about Brad Treliving. It's definitely something that needs to be looked at. Kind of similar to in Vancouver with Jim Benning. And it's kind of interesting that Jim Benning and Brad Treliving are kind of in that same vein, because both of those general managers were assistant general managers where they worked under an established general manager, and they both joined their teams at their respective times. And I remember Jim Benning was also considered to be a general manager for the Calgary Flames after when we moved on from Jay Feaster and Brian Burke took over. I still feel that if Joe Nieuwendyk wanted that job, and it still would have been interesting, it might have been still kind of that old boys club, given what he learned from Dallas. I still think Joe Nieuwendyk would have been the general manager for the Calgary Flames after Jay Feaster if he wanted that job. Because I heard that he was in the running and wasn't interested in the job because he didn't want to move out of Dallas, especially with his younger family. And of course, Joe Nieuwendyk despite, how things ended and we traded the best centerman away for the best Flame all time, I have no hard feelings about Joe Newendike. But getting back to Brad Treliving, I think we've drafted better, and then we stayed somewhat competitive, but it's just that in-out pattern and just being stuck in neutral. It's like I think we might have to consider possibly make a change, and then the only change I can think of that would actually make an impact for the Calgary Flames if we decide to go down that road is John Davidson. That's the only candidate I could think of potentially if we were to switch out the general manager. To have an agreement that Darryl Sutter still remains general manager, because I do not think we should go back to the general manager well with Darryl Sutter, because that didn't necessarily work out. We would be kind of in the same spot that we're in right now, except Darryl Sutter was even more of a riverboat gambler and spends to the cap, where we traded away too many high draft picks and prospects, where we keep staying stuck in neutral, or it's like we can't afford that player at that time, so we let him go in free agency to only a couple years later make a trade to get him back when he's older and more expensive. That was the Darryl Sutter way. But that's just my, kind of a ramble video about Brad Treliving, that should the Calgary Flames consider possibly moving on from him. This is definitely a discussion that needs to be looked at, because we're expected to make the playoffs. I know this season was unique in terms of just being in the divisional play, no fans in attendance, and always facing the same team in your division. It was exciting and great to have the North All-Canadian division, but we couldn't get to feel out the rest of the league. But then that was also one of the reasons why the Calgary Flames decided to move on from Jeff Ford and brought back Darryl Sutter, and I'm going to say we're still kind of in the same place we are right now. And surprisingly, we have trouble scoring, but that's what I think. It took 7 years for Calgary to finally find a stud number goalie. That was a sore spot during Brad Treliving's tenure, but it hasn't been, changing the core. And this might be the off season to do it, but is Brad Treliving the guy to do it? I wouldn't mind a John Davidson coming in if we decide to move on for him. And I think it's fitting, because John Davidson spent some time playing hockey in Calgary in his junior days. So it'd just be fitting if he works for the Calgary Flames at some point in his career. And this is the opportunity for it, but it's just, the free agency has been so-so, but you could say I probably know general manager. I'm going to say trades and drafting, I think, has been better with Brad Treliving when I compare it to Darryl Sutter and Jay Feaster. But we just been stuck in neutral, and this still has to be a decision that has to be made. So anyway, let's say enough of that. What are your thoughts on what I think, and do you think the Calgary Flames should potentially move on from Brad Treliving? I give my candidate on if we decide to, and John Davidson, now that he's available. Well, who would you consider bringing in if it's not John Davidson? Would you go back to the Darryl Sutter well again? I don't think it would be wise at this point, but you just never know. But we need to do something to change course, because we're stuck in neutral right now. So anyways, like to say, if you want to follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey, home of the Flames, Hitmen, Roughnecks, and Stampeders, I mostly do talk Calgary sports on my YouTube channel, recapping games or stories, or just talking about some of what I feel about potentially what the Calgary Flames could do with this video. But I also do a variety of non-sports content, like personal vlogs, attempt at comedy, and I also do share my experience I'm on the road or a sport event. And I've also been doing a little more on-the-go vlogging, where I've been going out and about, and actually went to my old high school recently in the old neighborhood at Crescent Heights. I actually did get some sun. That's why I'm home more red. Not because we missed the playoffs, but just because I got a lot of sun, and it was a nice day. So that all sounds like it'd be interesting to watch, to follow along with this Calgary sports fan's journey. You know what you need to do, just make sure you hit like and subscribe. I also have my other social media links down in the description below. So I'm going to say, should the Calgary Flames consider possibly moving on from Brad Treliving? And if we do, who would be that new general manager that you bring in that you think that would get Calgary out of neutral? So as I want to say, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.